What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, bringing you the top Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Very exciting week in Pokemon card auctions, folks. We saw the unfortunate sales of some first edition base set holos. We also saw a couple of Pokemon Snap promo cards come by that you've probably never seen before. And we saw a BGS 9 Pikachu Illustrator card that came by an auction. What did it sell for? Stay tuned. You're about to find out. Thank you so much for your support, folks. I really appreciate it. A quick shout out to today's auction recap sponsor, CantoShark.com, the ultimate Pokemon card marketplace. Check out CantoShark.com, where they are currently having a Black Friday sale with some fresh new inventory that just hit the website. Speaking of websites, theirs just got a brand new update, where now you can more easily browse their graded cards, their booster packs, and their booster boxes they have up for grabs. Treat yourself right this holiday season and go buy something pretty over at CantoShark.com. Alright folks, let's jump into this auction recap, starting off with some graded cards from Paradox Rift. We have a couple examples of the Roaring Moon EX. Here is one as a PSA 10 that sold for $153, another one here that sold for $175. And what's weird is, on the label, the first one says it's a hyper rare, and the other one says it's an ultra rare. So, I don't know. We saw the hyper rare Garchomp EX in PSA 10 that sold for $157, while the special illustration rare Garchomp EX sold for an even $200. Up next, we saw 3 sales of the Iron Valiant EX special illustration rare. This one here sold for $255, another one sold for $232, and the last one here sold for $202.50. And then lastly, for Paradox Rift, we saw this special illustration rare Roaring Moon EX, easily the most valuable card from this set, sold as a PSA 10 for $720. And then we saw cards from the English version of the Pokemon Trading Card Game Classic. Here is the trio Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, and Venusaur cards from that deck that sold for $86 US. Here we have the Squirtle, Wartortle, and Blastoise that sold for about $88 US. And then here we have the Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard holos that sold for $177.50. So I'll be curious to see what the rest of these cards sell for once they hit the auction market, and also what the box of this will sell for eventually. I know it came out hot and heavy with a pretty high price tag. Do you think that price will sustain? You think it'll go up higher, lower? Let me know what you think in the comments. On to some interesting vintage sales. We have a Japanese Venusaur holo in PSA 10 that sold for $710. We saw this first edition PSA 10 Venusaur from base set that sold for $10,800, which might seem like a lot, and it is, but let me remind you that almost 2 years ago, back in early 2022, this card had sold in auction for $30,000. So, what is that, about a 66% decrease from then till now? Not good. Here we saw the Japanese base set Blastoise that sold for $775. We saw the Unlimited English Blastoise card that sold for $2,197. And then we saw the first edition Stoise in PSA 10 that sold for $20,850. And just like Venusaur, folks, this card has seen better days as a PSA 10, as it had previously sold back in mid-2021 for $55,000. And let's not forget my boy Mewtwo, as a PSA 10 sold this week for $11,100. And that price has cut in half since the last time we saw this sale earlier this year, where it sold for $24,600. From Jungle Set, we saw the first edition Flareon holo sell for $1,650. From Gym Challenge, we saw a first edition Blaine's Charizard sell for $4,300. We actually saw several Neo Destiny cards come by, but the regular holos, for the most part, aren't very expensive, except for these guys right here. Here we have a Light Togetic first edition holo that sold for $2,000, along with this first edition Dark Espeon that sold for $2,194. Here's an unlimited Shining Tyranitar that sold for $1,625, and a Shining Kabutops that sold for $910. And then lastly, for the Neo series is this Shining Mewtwo First Edition Holo that sold for 2,950 big ones this week. One card from the E series that was this holographic Umbreon from Aquapolis that graded a PSA 10, and the case was signed. by Arita, but I don't think the signature was verified or authenticated. But this slab sold for $2,513 this week. Up next, we saw several cards from EX Team Rocket Returns. Here is a Rockets Sneasel EX in PSA 10 that sold for $898. Here is a Rockets Articuno EX that sold for $1,136. A Rockets Scizor EX that sold for $1,625. From Emerald set, we saw this Altaria EX in PSA 10 that sold for $710. And then from EX Dragon, we saw this Latios EX that sold for $740. Also from Dragon set was this Ampharos EX that sold for $775. And then the Blissey EX from Unseen Forces sold for $1,225. And also from Unseen Forces was this Ho-Oh EX that sold for $1,136 this week. And then lastly, for our EX cards, at least the English ones, was this Lugia EX, also from Unseen Forces, that sold for $2,950. And then here is a Japanese 7,000 point Mew EX promo that sold for $2,550. Here we have a couple of gold stars. Here is an SGC-10 Gold Star Charizard from EX Dragon Frontiers, sold for $8,300. Now normally SGC is kind of hit and miss with the quality of their grading, but I was looking at this card and it looked pretty good on the front and on the back. I don't know, what do you think? It looked pretty clean to me. Maybe they were going to buy this and crack it open, grade it somewhere else, I don't know, but this card sold for $8,300 this week. And then we saw the Gold Star Espeon come by again from the Pop Series 5, sold for $8,566. And then from the PWCC weekly auction block, we saw another first edition Flareon from Jungle. This one here sold for $1,200. Here is a first edition Jolteon that sold for $1,710. Here is a CGC-10 Perfect Misty's Gyarados from Gym Challenge. Pop 1 card, and it will remain that way because CGC is no longer giving out perfect grades. This card sold for $1,260. And this card has to pretty much stay in the slab because if you transfer it over to the new CGC labels, I think they're just going to mark it as a pristine and not a perfect. So if that were me, I definitely want to keep this in the perfect slab. Here we have a lot of 3 base set Charizards that were signed by Arita and were authenticated. The card itself was not graded, but all 3 of these cards sold for $3,720. Here we have a CGC-10 Gem Mint Gold Star Mudkip that sold for $3,840. Here we have a PSA-10 graded first edition base set booster pack with the Charizard art that sold for $4,440. Here we have a 2015 Art Academy Tangrowth card in PSA 10 that sold for $5,040. And then here is another CGC 10 perfect card. It is a Japanese XY Promo Center Mega Battle Tokyo's Pikachu card that sold for $5,520. And then here we have a 2003 Japanese Promo Battle Road Victory Orb card that sold for $7,800. And then the most expensive card this week sold on PWCC was the Reverse Holo Charizard from Legendary Collection as a PSA 10, sold for $11,400. And then we saw 2 booster boxes on PWCC. We saw a Japanese Fossil booster box sold for $12,600 and a Japanese Jungle box that sold for $13,200. And then on to the massive sales from Golden Auctions this past week. We have a Black Label Japanese Rayquaza GX that sold for $1,769. And then we saw another Black Label card. This one is the Japanese Black Star Promo Gym Challenge Legends card that sold for $2,806. We saw a couple of test print base set holos that came by. Here's a CGC9 test print Cosmos Poliwrath card that sold for $2,501. Here is a CGC 8.5 Magneton test print card that sold for $2,684. We have a CGC 8.5 Chansey test print card that sold for $3,422, and then a CGC 8.5 test print Venusaur that sold for $3,878. And then we also saw this CGC 8.5 test print Alakazam Holo that sold for $4,481. Up next, we saw several of the Disco Holo test print cards from base set. Here is a CGC 8 Zapdos card that sold for $5,307. Here is a CGC 8 Raichu that sold for $5,368. And then a CGC 8 Mewtwo that sold for $6,100. And then lastly, for the Disco Holo test print cards is a CGC 8 Blastoise that sold for $10,675. Up next, we saw the Gold Star Mewtwo from EX Holon Phantoms is a PSA 10, sold for $4,086. Here is a CGC 10 Gem Mint First Edition Lugia that sold this week for $6,611. Here we have an XY 20th Anniversary Black Star Promo Pikachu Festa card in PSA 10 that sold for $7,591. And then we saw another Gold Star Espeon from the Pop Series 5. This copy here sold for $8,784. Here we saw a Stormfront Charizard Holo signed by Arita that sold for $3,849. And then we saw the first edition base set Zard signed by Arita that sold for $10,004. We saw two Black Label poncho wearing Pikachus. Here is a Black Label Mega Charizard Y poncho wearing Pikachu that sold for $8,540. And then here is the Black Label Mega Charizard X poncho wearing Pikachu that sold for $10,573 this week. A couple more Japanese promo cards. Here is a PSA 7 1999 Tropical Mega Battle promo card that sold for $10,737, while this 2004 PSA 10 Tropical Wind promo card sold for $12,505. And this BGS 8.5 University Magikarp sold for $11,103. Here we saw a Topps Chrome Sparkle Charizard card in PSA 10 that sold for $11,590. Here we have a BGS 10 Japanese Gold Star Rayquaza that sold for $12,686. And then lastly, we saw the CGC 10 Gem Mint 2004 Staff Tropical Wind promo card that sold for $20,130. Up next, we saw a base set unlimited booster box sell for $15,860. And then we saw three Pokemon Snap promo cards. This one is Squirtle, got the PSA 8 grade and sold for $73,200. And then we also saw this PSA 7 Charmander Snap card that sold for $79,300. And then we saw the PSA 9 Bulbasaur Snap card that sold for $80,520. And if those numbers weren't big enough, folks, check this out. Here's a lot of PSA 9 and PSA 10 copies of all of the cards from the corporate history deck that sold for $115,900. I believe there were 15 PSA 10 cards in this lot. I think the Charizard was a PSA 9. But yeah, man, $115,000. That is nuts. Which brings me to the auction of the week. It is, of course, the BGS 9 Pikachu Illustrator card that sold for $274,500 this week. Whew, mamma mia, those are some big numbers. What do you think of the auctions this week, folks? Let me know in the comments below. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I thank you so much for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it. That's all I got. I'll catch you all in my next one.